A young Florida mother is shot to death, and now authorities are piecing together what this has to do with an attempted disgusting prank. Former homicide prosecutor Melba Pearson comes on to explain this tragic new story. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Strange story out of Florida. I mean, how many times have I said that? But this really is a sad and odd case. I'm talking about 22-year-old Ashley Voss, a mother of two, who was found dead in her car, a gunshot wound to her back. The rear window was shattered. She was parked in front of her grandmother's house with whom she had been living. Authorities believe she was killed shortly after 1 a.m., maybe around 1:14 a.m. after returning home from work. And the man arrested turned out to be Aurelio Diaz, a friend of the man who happens to be the father of Voss's child. Now you may say, oh, I see where this is going. Well, it gets weird because the father admitted that he and Diaz were there that night, but not to kill Voss, but to play a disgusting prank. Let me bring in criminal law attorney and former homicide prosecutor Melba Pearson to join in this discussion. Melba, it's great to see you. So the father, who isn't being named because he hasn't been charged, he's just referred to as a witness for now, he admits to police that he and Diaz are in the area. He's shown surveillance footage of two men walking around in the neighborhood between 12:20 a.m. and 1:14 a.m. This was taken off of, I believe, a neighbor's surveillance footage. And the father says that, that's them. And he says the plan was for Diaz to defecate on Voss's front porch. In fact, the arrest affidavit says, quote, the witness pointed out the victim's residence and the defendant later exited the witness's vehicle to defecate on the victim's porch. The witness stated at no time did he talk to the defendant about killing the victim, shooting the victim, or harming the victim. They were only having a prank to have the defendant defecate on the victim's porch. I thought I've heard it all. I've never heard that. What's your thoughts?
So great to be with you, Jesse. And I do have to ask, as a Florida resident, why is Florida like this, right?
I don't know.
Know if it's the water. I've got so many questions.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's bizarre, but it has such a sad ending to this, and just like a weird. I had to do a double take when I saw this story.
Yeah, and I have to say that I don't believe the narrative that the witness, and in my estimation, soon to be defendant, is saying, because that just doesn't make sense. Why are you going to go out of your way to go to your ex-girlfriend's or your mother of your child's home to have someone defecate there, but then somehow it turns to gunshots? I don't see the motive. From the fact of the matter is, the person that's charged right now, what motive does he have to shoot and kill the victim? He doesn't particularly know her. He's, based on what's been available thus far, he is friends with the father, who would arguably have that motive to kill her because they were engaged in a battle over child support. So, I think it's just too much of a leap that it went from, we talked about defecation to all of a sudden we're in murder. That's just a huge leap. I don't see the defendant making that leap on his own. I think he was put up to it by.
Okay, so that's the way it might look because, in fact, the victim's grandmother, her name's Rhonda Voss. She was living with her grandmother at the time. She said, basically something's not adding up. She goes, there was no motive. She said Diaz didn't know actually her. Well, he knew her, but they were not close. It's not something where something could have happened or something could have transpired that would have made him murder her. So you're seeing this lack of a connection between Diaz, the person who's currently arrested for the murder of this woman, and the victim. And so that's where it gets weird. And then you read a little bit more of the story. And this is the part that I think is really interesting. As I mentioned, he said he was on surveillance footage, but what was really interesting, so they only showed him one part of their surveillance footage. There was another video that they didn't show him. This other video shows a man directly next to the Nissan Altima and appears to discharge a firearm one time before running north on Orange Street out of the camera's view. Now, it's interesting that they didn't seem to tell this witness, this father, about this video when they questioned him. They guess they wanted to independently see if he would acknowledge that was him and Diaz on the tape first, because that is really bad evidence against seemingly both of them, no?
Absolutely. That's terrible evidence because, again, he's placed himself at the scene. He's placed both of them at the scene. And now we have independent video that corroborates that that shooting happened around the same time that they were on the scene. So again, if they were not the people involved in the shooting, they would have witnessed something and then they would have come forward and said, listen, actually we saw a person meeting this description running in that direction. We heard the shots, we ran out of fear, whatever the case may be. But again, the story is not adding up and the evidence is not leaning in favor of the defendant or the father of the child at this juncture.
But that's usually come with a prank that you're going to defecate on the porch. I don't get that. It's so wild. It makes me think, like, how did you make that up?
I mean, maybe that was something that they talked about. Maybe it's, maybe they were drinking, maybe there were substances involved and it sounded like a great idea and devolved into something else on the way over. They may have been watching the, Depp versus Heard trial and somehow got some ideas from that. I don't know. But again, there is no logic, and not to say that crime is logical, but there has to be, some continuity in what makes sense, and this does not make sense.
And he, like I said, this father who's only being identified as a witness, he hasn't been arrested or charged, but I mentioned that surveillance footage that basically looks like it shows Diaz opening fire, and again, he admitted that he and Diaz were in that area, like you said, but it gets worse because according to this affidavit, the witness eventually made what is called a controlled phone call to Diaz. It was recorded by law enforcement. And the defendant, at one point during the call, this again, Mr. Diaz, tells this father, this witness, I did it just like I told you, walked up to the back window and boom. What is a controlled phone call? How did law enforcement make this happen?
So a controlled phone call is basically when the law enforcement sets up a call with a target. So in this instance, you had the father who's claiming that, listen, I didn't know anything from anything. I was with the defendant. We were going to engage in this prank. Here, let me prove it to you. I will call him. You can record and you can hear the entire conversation with regards to what happened on that day to show that I had no involvement.
But that means that Diaz is cooperating with law enforcement after his arrest?
No, this would mean that the father is cooperating with law enforcement, saying, listen, I have no involvement in this. I will call Diaz in front of you and show that, listen, we didn't plan this. I don't know why he did this, whatever his version of events is.
But what he said is turning back on the father.
Absolutely. Because again, maybe he misjudged. Maybe he thought that their friendship would carry him and the defendant is not going to say anything. Basically, snitches get stitches kind of mentality, right? So he may be thinking that because of this code or friendship that the defendant won't say anything. But the reality is, listen, he's seeing that he's at the courthouse steps. He is going to roll on his friend as quickly as he can because the first one who can lock down the deal is usually the one who is able to get the better outcome, generally.
And talking about why would this ever happen? Well, apparently investigators have learned through Voss's family that this father, this witness who hasn't been charged, allegedly threatened Voss over child support, which is, we see in a lot of these cases, violent cases, that child support, divorces, that custody, those are some of the reasons you see people take actions. Now, again, he hasn't been charged at the time of this recording. Why do you think he hasn't been? I've just laid out a motive, surveillance, a witness tying him to it. Why do you think he hasn't been arrested at this point or charged? And again, because he hasn't, his identity hasn't been revealed. There's nothing we can say more about it. But why do you think he hasn't been charged?
It would be my belief that the investigation is ongoing, that law enforcement are maybe going through his phone records, going through bank records, looking for any other indications to support the motive, anything else to support that he asked the defendant to do it. Because again, we're in a situation of, is this murder for hire? Is he basically paying his friend in exchange for whatever, whether it be money, whether it be drugs, whether it be, any other aspect? Because we've seen a number of things be used as payment in these types of situations. So anything is on the table. So the question is, what led the defendant to commit this murder? What instigated it? Was it a matter of this is money? Was it that he was told all these horrible things about the victim and is acting on the behalf of his friend because he felt bad for his friend? These are all things that need to be solidified before the police make an arrest, because again, once you make an arrest, the clock starts ticking in terms of the time frame that you have to go to trial. So the prosecutor doesn't have forever to try and find more evidence. You want the most complete packet of evidence that you can at the time of filing. And if extra pieces of evidence, extra witnesses come forward along the way, great. But you want to be very solid at the time that the case is filed. So that's what I believe is happening.
And if he gets arrested, do you think a viable defense would be just point the finger at Diaz, point the finger at him, saying it was a misunderstanding, or I never told him to do this, he did this on his own? Diaz saying, no, you directed me to do it. You imagine that is what we may see?
I think absolutely that's what we would see in that instance. I believe that the father is going to say, listen, I never told him to do this. You can't prove I told him to do this. Let's say there's no phone records or no text messages or no financial statements to support that this was a murder for hire. They're going to lean very heavily into that to say Diaz acted on his own accord. I don't know why he did it, but he did it. And so find him guilty, not me. I think that's going to be the best defense he's going to have going forward.
And like I said, this witness, this father who hasn't been named, he hasn't been charged. Mr. Diaz, he's being detained in the Hillsborough County Jail without bond. And the family has set up a GoFundMe. The victim's family has set up a GoFundMe to help alleviate some of the costs of the funeral expenses, to help provide support for her sons. I mean, she's a young mother, and her grandmother released a statement saying she was just a typical 22-year-old girl. She did absolutely nothing to deserve this. Ashley was a loving mother, and her life was her 2 children. Just a really sad but strange case, to say the least. Melba Pearson, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.